Section 2, Excitable Tissue. This is Chapter 1, Ionic Equilibrium and Resting Membrane Potential. So in this chapter, we're going to discuss how excitable tissue works. We'll start with a very basic overview that is very key, will be an important part of our foundation that we need in order to negotiate any kind of question on USMLE Step 1 that arises associated with excitable tissue. We have 4 electrolytes illustrated on the slide. We also have a cell, a basic excitable cell here. Could be a nerve, could be cardiac tissue, could be a skeletal muscle, etc. Now, we have 4 electrolytes listed here, and one of our key foundations, one of the very important things we need to appreciate, is the concentration gradient for these electrolytes. Notice, sodium, calcium, chloride. I have them highlighted on the slide. They are higher outside the cell when compared to the inside. So we have a concentration gradient for sodium, calcium, and chloride to diffuse into the cell. Now we already know the basic concentrations of sodium and chloride. If you remember back from the very first section where we went through the BMP, we didn't include calcium on that, but the key, we do know extracellular concentrations. Those is what we measure in the plasma. We don't care what the intracellular concentration is for these. We just need to remember the concentration gradient. Now, potassium is the outlier. Notice that the concentration of potassium is much higher inside the cell than it is outside. Again, potassium is on our BMP, so we do know the extracellular concentration, but we don't care what the exact intracellular concentration is for potassium. In fact, determining the intracellular concentrations is dubious at best. And so we really don't care what the level is, but we do need to know that there is a concentration gradient for potassium to diffuse out of the cell. Now, there is a separation of charge across this membrane, and we will go into more details related to that. But this slide sets up the idea of concentration gradients. One caveat to remember, the calcium concentration we're talking about inside the cell is the free cytosolic calcium. It is not the total amount of calcium inside the cell. Remember, we have sarcoplasmic reticulum, endoplasmic reticulum that can store a lot of calcium. We're not talking about the calcium in those intracellular sites. What we're talking about is free cytosolic calcium. So, know the basic concentration gradients. All right, there are some key components that we have to understand in order to work with excitable tissue. Once we get these key components down, then we just build and build upon this all the way to the function of the excitable tissue. The first is membrane potential. This is the separation of charge across the membrane. It exists at rest. And hopefully you remember from physics long ago that separation of charge means there's the potential to do work. And this potential to do work is measured in volts. It's going to be more specifically millivolts for biological tissue. The EM that we indicate here, this membrane potential, is just simply the measured value. I don't know where you live, but if you go to an electrical outlet in the United States, there's 120 volts. Many other countries use 220 volts. Well, volts just means the potential to do work, and it's a magnitude of that potential. All right, that's a separation of charge. Go stick your tongue on an outlet. Yep, it'll work. That's what volts mean. Second big concept is electrochemical gradient. We have to remember that ions diffuse based upon a chemical or concentration gradient, And as we will remember, I'm sure, this is from high to low. So from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, solutes, including ions, will diffuse. But the key characteristic here is that ions also have charge, and so they will diffuse based upon electrical gradients. Don't forget, electrical, all we have to remember is that opposites attract. Like charges repel and opposites attract. So electrochemical gradient is a mixture or combination of the two gradients driving the diffusion of ions. It is the chemical or concentration gradient and the electrical gradient. So hence the term electrochemical gradient. Next, very big concept for excitable tissue, and this is really a big one, is something called the equilibrium potential. The equilibrium potential is that membrane potential that results in no net diffusion of an ion or ions. So it's at equilibrium, all right? Equilibrium. Now, equilibrium does not mean, notice it does not say that it obliterates the concentration gradient. Equilibrium potential is that membrane potential that results in no net diffusion. Once we get to the equilibrium potential, if a cell gets to the equilibrium potential for an ion, that tendency of the ion to diffuse in one direction, say chemical gradient, is counteracted by the electrical force going in the opposite direction. So I may have a chemical gradient for it to diffuse into the cell, but I have an electrical pull driving it out of the cell. Equilibrium potential is when those two forces are in balance or they completely counteract one another. Any ion, we can calculate an equilibrium potential by using the Nernst equation. We get to use mathematics. Woohoo! Yeah, I do. Okay, maybe you're not fired up about that. But that's the importance of the Nernst equation. It calculates the equilibrium potential for any given ion. Let's talk more about the Nernst equation in just a bit. Next concept for excitable tissue is something called conductance. And it's just as the name implies. If you think about the idea of something conducting, that means that it allows the flow of electricity. We have copper wire that conducts electrical current. Well, it's the same idea here. Conductance just means the flow of ions across cell membranes. Now, remember, ions don't easily cross the lipid bilayer, and they're going to go across the cell membrane via channels. So we'll discuss channels a bit more detail in a little bit. Now, the relative permeability of the membrane to an ion is determined by the open and closed states of these channels. So, the greater the permeability, the greater the conductance. So, an open state leads to high permeability and thus high conductance, whereas a closed state results in low permeability and low conductance. So again, conductance is just a term describing the flow of an ion across a cell membrane. Do you remember what the inverse of conductance is? If you said resistance, excellent job. Last fundamental concept is something called net force. The net force is that driving force for the diffusion of an ion. Net force is membrane potential minus equilibrium potential. All right, let's think about what this is actually saying. Net force is just telling us how far any given ion is from equilibrium with respect to the membrane potential. So in other words, if I have a membrane potential at a certain millivolt, I have an ion that has an equilibrium potential. The closer those two numbers are, the less the net force is driving the ion. If, on the other hand, the membrane potential and the equilibrium potential for a given ion are far apart, then I have a very high net force. I have a big force trying to get that ion to equilibrium. We all want equilibrium. It's a nice, relaxed state. Well, so does the ion. And the further the cell is, its membrane potential is from equilibrium to a given ion, the greater the force driving that ion toward equilibrium. Now, that doesn't mean it gets to equilibrium, because that goes back to our previous concept, which is conductance. If conductance is very, very low, then it certainly can't drive that cell toward its equilibrium. When conductance is high, then it can move toward the equilibrium for the ion. All right, those are our big fundamental concepts for excitable tissue. Make sure you review these and have these down very, very tightly, understand them well before we proceed on. Okay, here's a picture just to illustrate the idea of the three flavors of ion channels. Notice to the far left, our first was the ungated or leak channel. It's always open, so the ion can flux. And again, the direction that it's going to go will depend upon the electrochemical gradient for that particular ion. In this example, we have it as a potassium leak channel. Doesn't have to be potassium. Just turns out that potassium is a very important one, that we have a lot of leak channels for potassium. The middle shows a voltage gated. Notice that the gate indicated on the channel and the open and closed state is dependent upon voltage. Again, when the channel is open, high permeability, thus high conductance. When the gate is closed, the channel is closed, we have low permeability and thus low conductance. And the one on the far right just shows that we have a receptor for a ligand. It's a ligand-gated ion channel. The binding of the ligand, which could be a drug, could be an endogenous compound, could be a hormone that's endogenous, whatever, it binding to the receptor influences the open and closed state. So ion channels, ion channels, ion channels. These are the key. These are the key. This is an important foundation for excitable tissue. All right, ions move across membranes through ion channels. Ion channels, ion channels, ion channels. Such a key component, a huge component for understanding excitable tissue. We're going to have three basic flavors of ion channels. The first is called an ungated channel, or also known as a leak channel. Now, an ungated or leak channel, as its name implies, is always open. So an ion can easily go across even in the resting state. So the channel is open and the ion can conduct through the channel. Now, what direction the ion goes will depend upon the electrochemical gradient for that given ion. Electrochemical gradient is a concept we discussed previously. Leak channels are going to have a big impact. They're going to determine the resting membrane potential of a cell. And as we'll discuss, we have a lot of leak channels for potassium, and so potassium becomes a key player for resting membrane potential of excitable tissue. Second flavor of ion channels is a voltage-gated channel. Now, they name these very, very nicely. A voltage-gated channel is influenced by voltage. All right, the open and closed state is determined by the membrane potential. And channels will open and or close with changes in membrane potential. The open-closed state is regulated by voltage, hence the term voltage-gated ion channel. Last but not least is a ligand-gated ion channel, and just as its name implies, this channel will have a receptor that binds a ligand, and the ligand binding will change the channel state to either an open, typically, or a closed state. So it is regulated by a ligand, hence the term ligand-gated ion channel. In the next slide, we'll look at a little picture that kind of illustrates what we just went through. Now, we indicated there were three types of channels: leak, voltage gated, and ligand gated. But there's always one in the crowd, isn't there? There's always somebody who just, yeah, they just got to be different. Well, we have one in physiology, and that is a receptor called the NMDA receptor, N-methyl D-aspartic acid, NMDA receptor. It's an outlier. It's an exception to the rule because it is both voltage and ligand gated. There's always somebody. All right, let's look to the left and we'll talk about the idea of why it is voltage gated. When the membrane potential is more negative than about minus 70 millivolts, magnesium comes in and blocks the channel. So let's say that we have a membrane potential of minus 90. Well, magnesium then is going to block the channel. The channel can't open. If, on the other hand, the membrane potential is minus 50, then this removes the magnesium block. So this shows why it is voltage gated. The magnesium block is influenced by the voltage. Now, to the right, we see the idea that we have to have a ligand bind. So it acts like a ligand-gated ion channel. Ligand comes in, binds, and can open the channel. Sometimes it depends on the voltage. If the membrane potential, let's go to our example again. Let's say that the membrane potential is minus 90 millivolts. Well, you can put all the ligand on there that you want. Channel's not going to open because of the magnesium block, voltage gated. Let's say that the cell's at minus 50. The channel won't be open, but we won't have the magnesium block. Now if a ligand comes and binds, boom, opens the channel up. So it's ligand gated. So it's both ligand and voltage gated. It's an exception to the rule. Notice what it conducts. It's a non-selective cation channel. So sodium can move, calcium can move, potassium can move, but the sodium and calcium effect is going to dominate. It will cause the membrane potential to move toward zero. So again, the NMDA receptor, it is the exception to the rule. It's both voltage gated and ligand gated. It will not open without the ligand, and it also will not open if the membrane potential is more negative than minus 70 because of the voltage block. All right, let's recap what we talked about for the NMDA receptor. The ligands are glutamate and aspartate. These are sometimes referred to as the excitatory amino acid. So when they bind, they open the channel, provided that the membrane potential is less negative than minus 70. Okay? Because if membrane potential is more negative, then this ligand's not going to work. Magnesium continues to block. If the membrane potential is positive side of minus 70, or in other words, less negative, then the binding of glutamate or aspartate will work. So I have to have a ligand, and I have to have the membrane potential at the right level for the channel to open. As I already indicated, NMDA receptors are non-selective cation channel, but don't forget that calcium coming in. Calcium can do a lot of things. Remember that a rise in cytosolic calcium can trigger a whole host of intracellular changes. So it's non-selective, but don't forget that calcium. All right, it is an exception to the rule. It's a voltage-gated and ligand-gated. That's the NMDA receptor. Well, what are the big functions we need to think about for USMLE Step 1? Number 1, pain transmission. NMDA receptor is very important. We have lots of NMDA receptors in the CNS, and it is well described that NMDA receptors are involved in the transmission and ultimate perception of pain. Let's think a little bit of pharmacology while we're here. Can we think of any drugs that block the NMDA receptor? Oh, if you said ketamine, excellent. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic and is an NMDA receptor blocker. Another example is phencyclidine, PCP. Yeah, people on PCP, they feel no pain because NMDA is involved in the transmission of pain. Second big function is involved in memory. NMDA receptors thought to be involved in what's called long-term potentiation of cells, and this is an important component of memory formation. So the NMDA receptor, the exception to the rule, both voltage and ligand gated, very important in pain transmission, don't forget ketamine, PCP, and also involved in memory. All right, now let's talk about that big concept that we mentioned before. Let's go into a little more detail and really drive home the idea of equilibrium potential. This is a membrane potential that places an ion in electrochemical equilibrium. As we indicated before, it is calculated by the Nernst equation, and this is the Nernst equation. All right, is it important for you to memorize the Nernst equation? No, it's not important. You don't have to memorize it. It's based upon the charge and the concentration gradient, but you don't have to memorize it. What you do need to know is that the Nernst equation calculates the equilibrium potential. Now, why is that so important? Ions diffuse in a direction that move membrane potential toward their equilibrium. So the membrane potential moves toward the equilibrium potential for that ion. So the Nernst equation calculates the equilibrium potential, say for potassium. Now, if the cell can conduct to potassium, it's going to move the membrane potential toward the equilibrium potential for potassium. Big point. And it's always going to diffuse in a direction that moves membrane potential toward its equilibrium. Now, the ion conductance, as we indicated, is proportional to the net force. So again, the further an ion is from equilibrium, if I start increasing conductance, I have a big net force trying to drive it toward its equilibrium. And of course, the permeability of the membrane for that ion. That goes back to the idea of ion channels. If ion channels are closed, I may have a big net force because the membrane potential of the cell is a long way from the equilibrium potential for that ion. So there's a big force wanting to get there. It just can't because there's very low conductance. However, if I change the conductance, if I increase permeability and increase conductance, and I got a big net force, we're going to rapidly move the membrane potential toward the equilibrium potential for that ion. We'll talk more about this, but that's the key. All right? The membrane potential moves toward the equilibrium potential for an ion that has high conductance. Stated again, the membrane potential moves toward the equilibrium potential for a given ion. Now, let's think about this idea. The membrane potential is going to move toward the equilibrium potential of the most permeable ion. Well, let's stop and think about that. Hopefully that makes good sense. So if I have an ion that has relatively high permeability, that's going to drive the cell toward the equilibrium potential for that ion. And so ultimately, the membrane potential is going to move toward the equilibrium potential for whatever ion is most permeable. In other words, whatever ion has the greatest conductance. And that's a big key because the most permeable ion can change that fast, just rapidly. That will be the whole basis as we discuss the idea of an action potential. Now, even though it's not intuitive, it's very important to appreciate that the ion flux that we're talking about that can cause huge changes in membrane potential, the number or the amount of ions that are actually moving is negligible. So opening an ion channel is not going to alter intracellular or extracellular concentration of ions under normal conditions. All right, so I'm not changing particularly, it's particularly important to appreciate that I'm not really changing extracellular concentration of the ion. Now, we could get to the point where we change the intracellular a little bit, that calcium fluxing in, as I mentioned for NMDA, but that's not changing extracellular calcium. That is such a key component. So that movement, the movement of the ions across the membrane, is not changing extracellular concentration of that ion. Although this is not required for you to memorize, we're going to give you these numbers. Here are some equilibrium potentials for potassium, chloride, sodium, calcium. It is important to have this in your head as we work our way through this idea. So we have to know, for example, if I have a cell that is conducting potassium, has a high potassium conductance, it's going to drive that cell toward minus 95 because that's equilibrium for potassium. Contrast that with calcium. Let's say that we have a cell that has a high permeability to calcium. Well, that's going to drive that cell toward 125. Why? Because that's equilibrium for calcium. A couple of terms to use from now on. Depolarization means the membrane potential becomes less negative. All right, membrane potential becomes less negative. We mentioned a moment ago when we were talking about the NMDA receptor, cell starts at, say, minus 70. Well, if it goes to minus 50, then that's a depolarization. So we need a depolarization in a cell, for example, to remove the magnesium block on the NMDA receptor. Hyperpolarization, on the other hand, means membrane potential becomes more negative. So in our example before, we said minus 70. Let's say that the cell moves to minus 90. That's a hyperpolarization. And so a hyperpolarization is going to tend to create that voltage block, that magnesium voltage block in an NMDA receptor. Again, just an example. So we'll use these terms depolarization and hyperpolarization to describe events. So it's important to know the definitions. All right, as I indicated before, resting membrane potential. Big player is potassium. Here's the basic cell. Okay, we remember, hopefully we remember, concentration gradient for potassium is to do what? Yes, to leave the cell. We have a lot more potassium inside the cell than outside the cell. Now let's think about, well, what's the electrical gradient for potassium? If the inside is negative, then the electrical gradient is for potassium to move in. So I have a concentration gradient trying to drive it out. I have an electrical gradient trying to drive it in. Let's say that our cell starts at minus 70 millivolts. Now another thing that we mentioned earlier was that we have a lot of leak channels for potassium. All right, so that's what's illustrated on the slide. A lot of leak channels for potassium, which means potassium plays a key role in resting membrane potential. So if I change extracellular concentrations of potassium, then I'm going to alter the resting membrane potential. Hopefully that makes sense. If you need to stop and review that statement, please do so. Potassium is going to play a big key role in setting resting membrane potential. So if extracellular potassium changes, then I'm going to change resting membrane potential. All right, picture on the left shows an increase in extracellular potassium. So I have that highlighted with a box. The idea is we have increased extracellular potassium. Well, what's that going to do to the cell? It's going to depolarize excitable tissue. So hyperkalemia will depolarize. Contrast that with a hypokalemia. This will tend to hyperpolarize the cell. All right, how can we remember this so that we're trying not to memorize things for step 1. How can we just remember this? Well, we can just work with our idea of concentration gradient. Think about it. On the left, we have hyperkalemia. That means we had some condition that caused potassium to go up outside the cell. This rise in extracellular potassium means that I have less of a concentration gradient for potassium to diffuse out. That's why it's so important to know the concentration gradients for all the ions. So I'll state it again. Hyperkalemia means I have less of a concentration gradient for potassium to leave. Well, if I have less force pushing it out of the cell, then hopefully it makes sense to you that some of those positive charges are going to stay inside the cell, which means it depolarizes. So I just work with concentration gradients. I don't have to memorize hyperkalemia depolarizes, hypokalemia hyperpolarizes. All I have to do is you say the word and I just pull back the information that I already know. All right, concentration gradient is less in hyperkalemia, so it depolarizes. If I have hypokalemia, I have a bigger concentration gradient. Well, that means potassium's more likely to leave. That's a positive charge leaving. Bingo, hyperpolarization. That's an easy way to remember it. If you love equations, then just plug it into the Nernst equation. Okay, make extracellular potassium go up or down, and you will get a change in the equilibrium potential. It will become less negative, depolarize with hyperkalemia, will become more negative, hyperpolarize if you have hypokalemia. Plug it in if you like. But if you don't want to use the Nernst equation, just use concentration gradients. You'll get it right every single time. So to recap what we indicated, resting membrane potential in nerves is about minus 70 millivolts. It's about minus 90 in striated muscle. We'll illustrate that again. So which do you think has a higher potassium conductance, nerves or striated muscle? If you said striated muscle, very good, because that's closer to equilibrium for potassium. Remember, that was around minus 95 millivolts. We have a lot of leak channels, so high potassium conductance. Potassium is a big player in setting resting membrane potential. So again, if I get hyperkalemia, just think less concentration gradient, depolarization. Because it depolarizes, that means it gets closer to threshold for an action potential. Now let's take it to the next step from there. If I'm closer to threshold for an action potential, would a nerve be more excitable or less excitable? Hopefully you said more excitable. Absolutely. So acute hyperkalemia is going to cause depolarization. We're going to have nerves closer to threshold, so we're going to increase the overall excitability. If I hyperpolarized, like in hypokalemia, again, how do I remember which way hypokalemia is going to take the cell? If I have hypokalemia, that's less potassium out, more tends to leave. That's a positive charge leaving, therefore it's more negative hyperpolarization. Now, if the cell is hyperpolarized, it's further from threshold, which means it's going to have reduced excitability because I have much further distance to get to threshold. And again, we'll talk about the idea of threshold and the action potential in the nerve in just a moment. Now let's change potassium conductance. If I increase conductance to potassium, it's going to cause a hyperpolarization. Why is that? Well, let's say the cell starts at minus 70. Equilibrium for potassium is minus 95. So if I increase conductance to potassium, the cell will move toward equilibrium for potassium. So if I'm starting at minus 70, it's going to move toward minus 95. That's more negative. That's hyperpolarization. Now, because I have a high resting conductance, that means if I decrease potassium conductance, the cell will depolarized. It's going to go in the opposite direction. So again, always remember the cell membrane potential is going to move toward the equilibrium potential of the most permeable ion. So if I increase permeability to potassium, cell's going to move toward potassium equilibrium, which is minus 95. All right, the cell membrane is relatively impermeable to sodium, but it's not perfect. And that potassium wants to leak out because it wants to drive the cell toward its equilibrium, which is minus 95. And so we have to deal with that. And how we deal with that is the sodium-potassium ATPase. The sodium-potassium ATPase pumps that sodium that leaks in, pumps it out. And that potassium that's trying to escape, it pumps it back in. And the stoichiometry of that is a 3-to-2 ratio. We'll recap this on the next slide, but let's think for a second. If I take 3 positive charges out and only replace it with 2 positive charges, what's that going to do to the inside potential? Make it more negative or less negative? If you said more negative, you got it. Very good. I got 3 positive going out, only replaced it with 2. This pump is important for resting membrane potential as well as potassium conductance. All right, let's recap the main points of the sodium-potassium ATPase. Again, the membrane is relatively impermeable to sodium, but it's not perfect. Sodium still leaks in. And this sodium leak is counteracted by pumping the sodium out through the sodium-potassium ATPase. The pump is what we call electrogenic because, as we described on the previous slide, we're pumping 3 sodium out, that's 3 positive charges out, and only replacing it with 2 positive, 2 potassium. So more positive charges removed than replaced. That helps keep the inside more negative. Last but not least, I'm moving 3 solute out, replacing it with only 2 solute. So that's going to tend to cause some water flux out of the cell. So this pump is not only important for helping maintain the inside negative, it's also very important in the regulation of cell volume. Sodium-potassium ATPase, very important pump. We will see it many, many times throughout this physiology session. All right, let's recap what we talked about for chloride. Conductance of chloride is low at rest. So changing the extracellular concentration is not going to affect it. Normally it hyperpolarizes, but let's say that I had a resting membrane potential of minus 80 or minus 90. And I increase chloride conductance. Do you see why you would initially see a depolarization? You got it, because equilibrium for chloride is minus 76. So if the cell starts at minus 80 and I increase chloride conductance, then the cell is going to move from minus 80 toward minus 76. Which way did chloride move? If I made it less negative, if I depolarized, which way did chloride go? It's a negative charge. Did it enter or leave the cell? Yeah, for depolarization, the negative charge had to leave. For hyperpolarization, the negative charge has to come inside. So same story. If resting membrane potential were minus 90 and I increase chloride conductance, I'm going to drive the cell toward equilibrium for chloride. That's minus 76. If I start at minus 90 and I go to minus 76, if I'm using a negative charge like chloride, then chloride had to leave the cell. So you can see why this is the key. If you know resting membrane potential, if you know equilibrium potential, and you know the charge of that ion, then you know exactly what's going to happen if I increase conductance. And you can answer any kind of question that relates to it. If you understand that that's the principles driving the diffusion of ions. All right, we talked a lot about potassium. Potassium is a big player. Now let's think about the idea of these others, sodium and chloride. We'll start first with chloride. Again, we're going to say the nerve is about minus 70 inside. There's my equilibrium potential. For chloride, it's minus 76. Now, let's remind ourselves, what's the concentration gradient for chloride? Go in or out? Yeah, if you said in, very good, very good. I have a lot more chloride outside than inside. What's the electrical gradient for chloride? Yes, it wants to leave the cell. It's a negative charge. It's positive outside the cell. So electrically, it wants to go out. So chemically, it wants to go in. Electrically, it wants to go out. If I start this cell at minus 70 millivolts, and I increase chloride conductance, then the cell's going to hyperpolarize. How do I know that? Well, what numbers are going to move toward? Starts at minus 70, what numbers are going to move toward? You got it. What's illustrated on the slide, which is the equilibrium potential for chloride, minus 76. So if I start at minus 70 and chloride equilibrium is minus 76, if I increase chloride conductance, I'm going to hyperpolarize. So to recap, at rest, sodium conductance is very low, so changing extracellular has no effect on rest. But if I increase sodium conductance, I get a depolarization. Drive the cell toward plus 70 because that's equilibrium for sodium. Calcium is similar to sodium and to chloride in that conductance is very low at rest. So changing extracellular concentrations will have no impact on resting membrane potential. But hopefully you remember that the concentration gradient for calcium was to go in. The equilibrium potential is around plus 125. So if I have a cell starting at minus 70 and I increase calcium conductance, just like sodium, there's only one direction to go, and that's in, so it's going to depolarize. And it's going to work that cell toward 125 millivolts, plus 125 millivolts, because that's equilibrium for calcium.